All right, welcome back. It is time, Social 30-1, to take another look at the textbook, and today we're looking at Chapter 10. That's right, Chapter 10. So where does Chapter 10 fit into the scheme of things, into the scope here? We look at Chapter 10 after we look at 5, and this is our first look into political liberalism. So we're hoping that you leave Chapter 10 making that segue from political collectivism into political liberalism. So within Chapter 10, they're going to talk about more about authoritarianism and different types of dictatorships, like military dictatorships and oligarchies and one-party states. Things that we've talked about in our lesson that was associated with Chapter 5, but they'll go into a little bit more general detail here. But what Chapter 10 does, and does well, is it looks at the Canadian and the American political systems. So, jumping in, the first thing we look at is the concept of party solidarity. So, what is party solidarity? Party solidarity is a practice in Canada where members of a party that have been elected, so members of an elected caucus, may have more than just some subtle pressure on them to toe the party line and support the party in the House of Commons. So if there's a key vote coming up and the party obviously doesn't want to lose the vote, they're the government, then they may have the party whip come and knock on your door and talk about your responsibility to the party, and this is a form of like party discipline. And the party discipline is this idea that we need you to toe the line, otherwise there'll be negative consequences. You may be removed from from the cabinet, or you may be kicked out of the party. Good luck getting reelected without our support. So what is party solidarity? It's a tradition in Canada where members vote with the party. There are some rare free votes, but for the most part, once our politicians are elected by the people to represent us, they go and they represent the party instead. So this is a flaw of Canadian system. This is a challenge, a threat to democracy. It's a perversion of the will of the people. And therefore, if one is looking at how to reform political liberalism within Canada, one thing that they may need to address is the issue of party solidarity. When an elected member, instead of representing the constituents, is persuaded to represent the party, that may actually be supporting a policy that's not in the best interest of the constituents that the MP is representing, there's a violation of trust and responsibility there. So party solidarity prevails in Canada. Often we see it when there's a key vote on a bill that has money attached to it, government spending. That's a taxation bill or an appropriation bill. We're definitely going to see it in a vote of confidence or a motion of confidence or a motion of non-confidence. It'd be interesting if somebody within a party voted that they didn't have confidence in their own party. Obviously, that would be a time for them to be removed from said party. So that's how the chapter begins. It's kind of an interesting chapter that it just jumps right into something very specific like that. Interesting indeed. There's some good quotes here. John F. Kennedy is quoted from 1963 in Costa Rica saying, "Democracy is never a final achievement. It is a call to an untiring effort." So a couple of things that are takeaways from that is, yes, democracy isn't perfect. It's not a final achievement. It may need to be reformed, like the reform I was just mentioning. But also, once you have, as a nation, achieved democracy, that doesn't mean that the individuals within the nation can now become apathetic. This fits in with John F. Kennedy's previous quote that says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." It is trying to inspire activism and participation. If a democracy is the will of the people, then what is important for the will of the people to reign? The people people need to express their will. And if the people are sitting at home and bickering in silence, not really talking to anybody in government or anyone else, then they can't affect change if they only talk to themselves. So that is an important thing. The roots of democracy are explored next, and in a Jeffersonian way. I almost said that right. Thomas Jefferson in 1805 said the will of the people is the only legitimate foundation of any government, and to protect its free expression should be our first object. So Thomas Jefferson is obviously in his quote, the will of the people is the only legitimate foundation. That's a argument against the divine right theory, where the lottery of birth chosen by God determines who is and who is not the leader. And this is a founding principle of American democracy. It's the will of the people. So what job should the government be doing? It's the job that the people will. So if the people will the government to end the war in Vietnam, then they should end the war in Vietnam. If the people will the government to build a wall or not build a wall, or pass health care that is publicly funded, or not pass health care that is publicly funded, it's the people's will that the government should do. So in this case, the people lead the government, and that is interesting. And Lincoln extends this idea. Lincoln says, I want to get done what the people desire to get done. That's the worst Lincoln accent ever, but it's the same idea, that I want to do what they want me to do. In a democracy where you get elected by the people, that's probably a smart thing to think. Justin Trudeau, you work for me. You should listen to me. Jason Kenney, you should listen to me. If you don't listen, you will be fired eventually, when the people wake up. But not everybody agrees that democracy is the best form of a political system. Is governance by the will of the people even a desirable or a realistic goal? How do you consult 300 million Americans or 1.4 billion people in India? How do you let 1.4 billion people all steer the ship at the same time? Is that realistic? Is it even desirable? Can 1.4 billion Indian people all share the same amount of political insight? Maybe some groomed for the position, or some that have unique information to the problem at hand. Maybe their opinion should be weighed heavier, right? So there is some pull to silencing the masses and only listening to those most capable. So there has been a debate around spreading democracy then. Can we spread democracy to areas of the world that have authoritarianism or have a history of authoritarianism? So we look at the Middle East, we look at America and their endeavors at imposing liberalism in Iraq and Afghanistan. And just this year in 2021, the pro-American Afghani government controls less of Afghanistan than does Al-Qaeda. So why did we go to war in Afghanistan? What long-term results did we accomplish? Maybe they don't want democracy in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Libya, where it appears that the country in Libya had more stability under Muammar Gaddafi. But now that he's gone, there's civil war, and the economy has collapsed during said civil war. Winston Churchill weighed in on this, and he said democracy is the worst form of government. Except all those other forms that have been tried. So he's saying, you know what, it does need to be reformed, but it's better than anything else we've done. So democracy is a form of government in which the power is ultimately vested in the people. And we have two forms of it. We have direct and we have indirect. Direct democracy is what we have here in Canada. It's what you studied in grade 9 social studies. It's indirect democracy is representative democracy, because I indirectly make political decisions. I make political decisions through a proxy, and my proxy is my MP, my MLA, my alderman, my reeve, my mayor, these people that have been elected, chosen to represent me. So that is a representative democracy. It's more indirect. Whereas direct democracy, wow, that would be neat, wouldn't it? Direct democracy happens very, very rarely in Canada. We might have a referendum. In the United States, they have more opportunities for direct democracy. They have plebiscites where you let the plebeians, the masses, vote on issues that are too big for the politicians to decide on their own. Direct democracy, there is no proxy in the way. It's you making this choice, right? It's you expressing your opinion. Could that work with 40 million people? Well, it works in the United States with initiatives and plebiscites and referendums, so maybe we could have at least that, a step towards direct democracy. And maybe that would get rid of some of the apathy in Canada. We have had some referendums in Canada and in our history, 1980, 1995, referendums in Quebec, and Quebec to see if they should separate. We had a Charlottetown Accord in 1992 to see if we were happy with the new constitutional agreement that Mulroney had made with Quebec, and the people of Canada said, no, we're not happy with that. That's what led to the 95 referendum for Quebec leaving, and it was close, but they stayed, as you probably know, because they're here. So then the chapter goes into comparing and contrasting Canada's parliamentary democracy. So in your notes, you could have a section where it's like, here's what Canada's democracy looks like, here's what the American democracy system looks like. You know, who's the head of state, who's the head of government, how are they chosen, what kind of electoral system do they have, you know, are they bicameral, what is the separation of checks and balances, you know, how do the three branches of government, the executive, legislative, judicial branch, how are they chosen, how do they function, are they separate from each other? And by understanding these things, you'll understand political liberalism better. Starting with the Canadian parliamentary system, we have responsible government. We are so responsible. What does that mean? It means that, ultimately the power is vested in the people, and the government must be held responsible to the people. But it is expressed in votes of confidence and non-confidence, and that's how Prime Minister Paul Martin and his Liberals ended up losing the government, and Stephen Harper became Prime Minister in 2006. But aside from that action of responsible government, typically because of responsible government, we get party solidarity, which would mean the government is actually being less responsive to the will of the people. So it is a paradox that there are times that responsible government through votes of confidence can bring down an unpopular government, but there are other times that because the government fears falling, rather than responding to the wishes of their people, they will toe the party line. Canada is a representative democracy. We have rep by pop, representation by population. We have ridings across Canada, and the number of ridings changes as our population grows. Go from 272 to 281 to 295 to 301 to 335, and it will keep adding as more Canadians are added to our Canadian family. So we have these single member constituencies, and each constituency should have roughly the same number of people, but Canada is a not a unique country, but our population is not equally distributed. So we'll have some ridings of 140,000 people, and we'll have some ridings of 30,000 people. But the average is just over 100,000. And we're trying to keep most ridings within the average, because if you have a riding of 30,000 and one of 150,000, then the people who live in the riding of 30, they are actually getting 5 votes for every 1 vote that this other person gets. Because 30,000 become 1, 150,000 become 1. It's simple math, and it's not democratic. So we do have In the United States, the equivalent of Canada's House of Commons, we have the House of Representatives, and in the United States, it too is vote on or based on single-member pluralities, where constituencies, where it's a popularity contest that is measured through the same electoral system, first past the post. Um, so those two, the Parliament and the House of Representatives, or the House of Commons, House of Representatives, very similar, very, very similar. They are the ones who make the laws, right? But there are some differences when you look at the second house. In Canada, we have a Senate. That's the upper house. In the United States, they also have a Senate, but their Senate is elected. They have 400, or sorry, they have two senators from each state, and regardless of population. So California, 40 million people, two senators. Montana, less than a million people, two senators. So there is a tragic flaw there, but the House of Representatives is based upon the concept of one man, one vote. So the Senate isn't. The Senate is meant to be an expression of the United States of America. So each state is equal, but the Senate in the United States, because it's elected, is far more powerful than the one here in Canada, because it can trace its mandate to the will of the people. We have been elected. The Canadian Senate is appointed by the Prime Minister. So many people describe the Canadian Senate as a rubber stamp, as maybe a sober second thought. They're supposed to review legislation, but to what extent are they actually critical of the legislation being passed to them from the House? If they continue to say no to the information coming from the House, then it seems like they are, obstructing democracy. So they will amend things from the House, they will review things from the House, but ultimately they don't often reject things from the House in Canada. Both systems, as I mentioned, they do have that form of counting the votes called first past the post, and that electoral system is not common throughout the world. Most of the rest of the world use something called proportional representation, where instead of having to win an individual horse race, and we've mentioned this in the past when we talked about Nazi Germany, instead of having to win an individual horse race, they may look at your national popular vote. So if a party like the 1992 Progressive Conservatives of Canada have 16.7% of the popular vote, they should get 16.7% of the seats. They won two horse races. They had two seats. They should have had about 50. But they had two because Canada doesn't have proportional representation. And some people would say that our electoral system distorts the will of the people. It discourages anything but the mainstream parties to be supported, and it's silencing many credible ideas, and it's therefore limiting Canada's potential. So are there some challenges to the will of the people? Well, one challenge that the textbook breaks up is citizen participation. How do you measure the will of the people if the people cannot express it? So any democracy must pay explicit attention to the development of its young people. So how can we develop citizens? We need to develop them in their youth. Citizens are made, not born. And a part of that making of citizens comes down to critical skills and habits and attitudes that can be a part of education. One of the roles of here in social studies is we're meant to help create citizens of a free and democratic society. That's why critical thinking, not rote learning, is meant to be the focus of high school social studies. But the focus of high school social studies is currently under review, and many would want it to be more rote learning. 1867 is the answer. Just memorize stuff. Don't think critically. Just memorize. Yeah. So citizen participation is a prerequisite of a democratic system. Voting is a minimal act. There's many more forms of participation than just voting, but voting is kind of like that canary in the mine shaft. If voting rates are low, then it shows apathy among the citizens. And typically in Canada, we have had moments of extreme apathy. 2008 election, Only 59% of eligible voters voted. So that is a problem that plagues democracy. So some countries have gone and said, you know what, we're going to pass the legislation, and if you don't vote, you're going to get a fine. Voting is mandatory. Voting is mandatory in Australia, not in Canada. We don't find people here yet, but some would say that maybe we should to encourage it. Others might say, why would we want people that don't want to vote? Maybe we should have the opposite. Instead of having it mandatory, maybe we should have a competency test. That if you don't understand the issues, how can you vote on them? So there is some controversy surrounding voting. But if you take voting away from people, do you still have a democracy? So then we look at the power of interest groups to shape public policy. And then the textbook talks about other forms of measuring the will of the people, including something called consensus decision making that is popular in the Northwest Territories and in Nunavut. Shout out to our new Governor General, by the way, who is from the North. Should government rely on the people's will? Some keys to anti-political liberalism, right? So if you believe in authoritarianism, then you're probably anti, right? By definition, you'd be anti-political liberalism. So then the textbook talks about why might some people like authoritarianism? And the people who cast the votes decide nothing. The people who count them decide everything, as Joseph Stalin. So he's saying voting isn't really that important. Authoritarianism vests authority in an elite group. It might be an elite based on ideology or religion or ethnicity or lineage, family lineage. But there's something that they're saying that this elite have that others do not. So, for example, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's the kingdom of the Saudi family. It is not a democracy. And they're one of our allies, right? We have oligarchies around the world. An oligarchy is ruled by the few. And, at one time, Upper Canada was an oligarchy. One-party states. In practice, the Nazi Germans became a one-party state, right? As Hitler outlawed many of the other parties. So did Mussolini in Italy. Military dictatorships. You often see this in Latin America, where a military junta, J-U-N-T-A, takes over in a coup or a coup d'etat, a violent overthrow of the government. They take over government. Pinochet, with the help of the CIA, did this in Chile, and that's 1973. And we've seen it also in Pakistan in 1999. Military dictatorship. So how do these dictators assume power, and how do they maintain power? I kind of talked about this in chapter 5, but it's good to review it. The techniques of dictatorship include you need to sell a vision, right? Hitler had a vision. He had a book. He wrote it down. Mein Kampf. This is my struggle. This is my plan. This is what's holding Germany back. This is how we overcome it. So you need to have a vision. You need to sell the vision through literature, through propaganda, through indoctrination. You need to get the message out. Pageantry. You need to have a brand, right? You need to. People need to see it. It needs to be conversational. And to some extent, you want people to not be able to escape it. So if they can see it and you win them over, that's great. But as Machiavelli once said, it's better to be feared than loved. So even if they see it, even if they don't love it, they better see it and fear it so that they don't challenge it. Controlled participation. We may even give them a democracy, an election like Hitler did in November of 1933. And guess what? He ended up winning more than 95% of the vote because there's no one that could run against him. So you create a one-party state, you have you have an election, and your results are going to be amazing, and that gives some kind of air, some kind of idea that I have the consent of the people. Look, they voted for me. It gives some, false legitimacy, some pseudo, some quasi, some false legitimacy. you're going to have to redirect popular discontent, because there's going to be times that people are unhappy with you, and you're going to be like, hey, it's not me, it's the Irish. Wow, let's attack them. The Irish are bad people. So unfortunately, this leads to show trials and purges and genocides, and it can be very, very tough. In general, how do dictators seize power, and how do they maintain it? By terror, by force, by intimidation, by boots in the streets. So Hitler has his SA, and then later he will use his SS to even intimidate the SA. Mussolini has Mussolini has his own army as well. There's a fly here. I'm not a fan of that. Mussolini has his own army. He has the black shirts, and they will walk on Rome and take over the capital. So you're going to have this terror in the streets. There are some strengths and weaknesses of authoritarianism that ultimately, before you're done the chapter, before you're done the unit, you're going to want to create a T-chart and say, this is why people might like authoritarianism, and this is why people might not like it. These are under the conditions that people might will authoritarianism, and this is when they'll want more freedom instead. And that's kind of the longer term theme that we're at here. So that's an end to a summary of a chapter. I obviously have a lesson on this that you can look at in more detail, but for those of you without the textbook, I wanted to make sure you didn't really miss out on anything.